The moment that changed everything happened at Thanksgiving dinner, when my brother David stood up with his wine glass raised and said I'd like to make a toast to finally making vice president at Chen Industries, to hard work paying off, to being someone this family can be proud of. And he looked directly at me when he said that last part, his eyes making it clear that unlike him, I was not someone the family could be proud of. And everyone at the table raised their glasses, and my mother actually teared up and said, "Oh, David, we're so proud of you. You've worked so hard." And my father clapped David on the shoulder with genuine affection and said, "That's my boy. That's the son I raised to take over the business someday." And my sister Emily, who'd flown in from Boston for the holiday, said some of us got the ambition genes and some of us didn't. Looking at me with that mixture of pity and contempt I'd grown accustomed to over the past 10 years. I sat there at the end of the table where I always sat, the seat closest to the kitchen, because I was the one who got up to refill drinks and bring out dishes, the family servant essentially. And I smiled and raised my glass too and said, "Congratulations, David. That's wonderful news." And my voice didn't shake even though inside I was calculating the exact date I'd sign the papers that would make me David's boss, would make me everyone's boss actually. Because the acquisition I'd been quietly orchestrating for the past 18 months was 96 hours from completion, and in 96 hours, I would own Chen Industries, would own the company my father had built over 40 years, would own the building where David had his corner office and his nameplate and his inflated sense of his own importance. But they didn't know that. Nobody at this table knew that Rachel Martinez, the family disappointment, had spent the last decade building a tech empire that had just valued at $470 million, and was using a significant portion of that fortune to buy the one thing my family valued above all else, the company that had always been promised to David, the golden child, the heir apparent, the one they'd invested everything in while I was told repeatedly that business wasn't for girls, that I should focus on finding a good husband, that my role was to support, not to lead. Let me back up because this story doesn't start at Thanksgiving dinner. It starts 10 years earlier when I graduated from college with a degree in computer science and came home excited to tell my family I'd gotten a job offer at a startup in Silicon Valley. And my father had looked at me over his newspaper and said, "That's nice, Rachel, but when are you going to get serious about your future?" And I'd said, "I am serious. This is a great opportunity." And he'd said working for someone else's company isn't a future. The future is here at Chen Industries. And I'd said, "What about me working at Chen Industries?" And he'd actually laughed. Not a mean laugh, but a dismissive one. And said, "Sweetheart, the tech industry isn't for women. You'll get eaten alive. Why don't you think about getting your teaching certificate? Your mother's friend runs a nice preschool." And I'd looked at my mother hopping for support, but she just nodded and said, "Your father's right, dear. You're not cut out for that competitive environment. You're too sensitive." And David, who was home from business school, had said, "Yeah, Ratch, leave the business stuff to people who can handle it." And that moment, that exact moment of being dismissed by everyone who was supposed to believe in me, that's when I decided I'd prove them all wrong, not by arguing or defending myself, but by succeeding so thoroughly that they couldn't dismiss me anymore. I took the Silicon Valley job and moved across the country, and my family treated it like I was going through a phase, like I'd come home after a year having learned my lesson, and they threw me a small goodbye party where my father gave me a check for $5,000 and said, "This should hold you over until you realize this isn't working out and come home." And I'd taken the check and said, "Thank you," and used it as the initial deposit in a savings account I labeled Buy Chen Industries. Because even then I knew what I wanted, knew that the only way to make them see me was to take the thing they valued most and claim it as mine. The startup I joined was called Dataflow, and it was 6 people in a tiny office, and we were building software for data analytics that nobody thought would work. And I worked 100-hour weeks learning everything, coding and product development and business strategy, and I was good at it, better than good. I was exceptional. And within 2 years, I was leading the product team, and Dataflow had grown to 30 employees and was getting attention from investors. And I'd call home once a month, and my mother would ask when I was coming home, and whether I'd met any nice men, and I'd tell her about work, and she'd say, "That's nice, dear, but don't you want a family?" And I'd say, "I'm building something important," and she'd say, "Well, don't wait too long. You're not getting any younger. When I was 26, Dataflow was acquired by a larger company for $80 million, and my shares were worth $2.3 million, and I was suddenly wealthy in a way my family couldn't comprehend. And I called home to tell them, and my father said, "That's wonderful, Rachel. So you'll be coming home now. You've had your adventure and made some money." And I said, "No, Dad, I'm starting my own company." And he said, "With what money?" And I said, "With the money I just made." And he said, "Rachel, you can't risk that money on a business venture. You should invest it safely." And I said, "I am investing it in myself." And he'd sighed that long-suffering sigh he reserved for my poor decisions and said, "Well, don't come crying to me when you lose it all." I started my company 3 months later, called it Phoenix Solutions, because I wanted something that represented rising from ashes. And we built AI-powered business intelligence software that could predict market trends and optimize operations. And it was revolutionary, truly revolutionary. And within 18 months, we had 40 clients. And within 3 years, we had 400 clients. And within 5 years, we were the leading platform in our space. And I'd raised 2 rounds of venture capital, and Phoenix was valued at $150 million. And I owned 60% of it. And I was worth $90 million personally. And I still called home once a month. And my mother still asked if I'd met anyone, and my father still talked about the business like I worked at a lemonade stand. The breaking point came 3 years ago at Christmas when the whole family was together, and my father was talking about succession planning, about how David was being groomed to take over Chen Industries eventually. And Emily, who worked as a lawyer in Boston, was saying she might come back to work in the legal department. And they were discussing the future of the family company like it was a dynasty. And I said, "What about me? Could I come work there?" And the table went quiet, and then David laughed and said, "Ratch, no offense, but you don't have the business experience. You've been playing with computers. That's not real business." And my father said, "David's right. Running Chen Industries requires understanding manufacturing and supply chains and labor relations. It's not something you can learn from coding." And I'd felt something harden inside me, felt the last piece of my desire for their approval crystallize into something else, into determination, into a plan. And I said, "You're right. I don't understand your business, but I understand mine." And I left the table and went to my childhood bedroom, and I started making calls, started putting together a plan to acquire Chen Industries, started building the coalition of investors and advisors who could help me buy the company out from under my family and prove once and for all that I wasn't the disappointing daughter. I was the one they should have believed in all along. Phoenix went public 2 years ago, and the valuation was $470 million, and my personal wealth went from $90 million to $280 million overnight. And I was 34 years old, and one of the few female tech CEOs to take a company public. And the business press was writing articles about me, and investors were calling me visionary. And my family saw the articles because people kept sending them, kept saying, "Did you see Rachel's company went public? Aren't you proud?" And my mother called me and said, "We saw the news. That's wonderful, dear. Your father says congratulations." And I said, "Thanks." And she said, "So when are you coming home for a visit?" And I said, "I'm not sure. I'm pretty busy." And she said, "You work too hard. You need to slow down and think about your personal life." And I wanted to scream that my personal life was fine, that I was building something that mattered, that I had friends and relationships and a life full of meaning. But instead, I just said I'll try to visit soon and hung up and went back to work building the acquisition strategy that would let me buy Chen Industries. The company wasn't publicly traded, which made acquisition complicated. My father owned 60% and had a board of advisors who owned the rest. And I needed to convince the board to sell to me without alerting my father until the deal was done. And I spent 6 months quietly meeting with board members, presenting my vision for modernizing the company, showing them financials that proved I could take Chen Industries from a regional manufacturer worth $80 million to a national player worth 5 times that. And one by one, they agreed to sell me their shares, agreed that a cash offer at 40% above current valuation was too good to refuse. And by the time I had 40% of the company through board purchases, I went to my father and made an offer for his 60%. And he'd laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Rachel, this is a nice gesture, but I'm not selling. The company is going to David." And I said I'm offering you $120 million for your shares. And he said the company isn't about money, it's about legacy. And I said then sell me half and maintain your legacy while securing your retirement. And he said no. And I said then I'll force a sale. I own 40%. I can call a shareholder meeting. I can make this difficult. And he'd looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time and said, "You're serious." And I said I've never been more serious about anything in my life. The negotiation took 3 months, and it was brutal. My father hired lawyers to fight the sale, and I hired better lawyers to force it. And he tried to convince the board members to back out, but they were legally bound by contracts I'd made sure were airtight. And finally, his lawyers told him he was going to lose, that I had the leverage and the legal right and the financial backing to take the company whether he cooperated or not. And he could either sell to me for a fair price or watch me take it in a hostile takeover that would cost him more in legal fees than he'd save in purchase price. And he capitulated, signed the papers, took the $120 million, and called me a snake, called me disloyal, called me ungrateful. And I'd looked him in the eye and said, "You made me this way. You told me I wasn't good enough. You told me business wasn't for women. You told me to come home when I failed, and I never failed. I succeeded beyond anything you imagined, and now I own the thing you told me I could never have." And he'd walked out of the lawyer's office, and I hadn't heard from him in the 6 months since except for a curt email saying the family would be gathering for Thanksgiving, and I was expected to attend. I almost didn't go to Thanksgiving, almost sent a polite decline, but I wanted to see their faces, wanted to be there when David made his self-congratulatory toast, wanted the satisfaction of knowing that while he celebrated his promotion, I was technically his boss, and he just didn't know it yet, because I'd closed the acquisition 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, but had instructed my legal team not to announce it publicly until the following Monday. Wanted this one holiday with my family, where they still thought I was the disappointment, still thought David was the golden child, still thought they knew who had succeeded and who had failed, because their wrongness was delicious, was the revenge I'd been cultivating for a decade, was the moment I'd been building toward through every dismissal and every condescending comment, and every time they'd looked at me with pity instead of pride. So I'd flown home for Thanksgiving and sat at my assigned seat at the end of the table and helped my mother in the kitchen and listened to David talk about his promotion and watched my father beam with pride at the son who was everything he'd wanted. And I'd smiled through all of it knowing that in 96 hours everything would change, knowing that I'd done exactly what I set out to do, which was become so successful they couldn't ignore me, so powerful they couldn't dismiss me, so undeniable that they'd have to reckon with the fact that the daughter they'd underestimated had surpassed them all. The doorbell rang during dessert, and my mother said, "Who could that be? We're not expecting anyone." And I said, "Actually, I invited someone. I hope that's okay." And my mother looked confused but said, "Of course, dear. The more the merrier." And she went to answer the door and came back with James Wu, who was my chief operating officer at Phoenix and also my boyfriend of 2 years. Something my family didn't know because I'd stopped sharing my personal life with them years ago. And James was carrying a briefcase and wearing an expensive suit, and he shook hands with everyone and introduced himself and said, "Sorry to interrupt your holiday, but Rachel thought you'd want to hear this news in person rather than reading about it online Monday." And my father said, "What news?" And James opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder and said, "Rachel wanted me to present you with these documents. They're from the closing of Phoenix Solutions' acquisition of Chen Industries, which was finalized 2 weeks ago," and the room went completely silent. David said, "What acquisition?" And James said, "Phoenix Solutions, Rachel's company, purchased Chen Industries for $160 million. The sale included all assets, all intellectual property, all existing contracts. And as of November 15th, Rachel Martinez is the owner and CEO of Chen Industries." And he pulled out organizational charts and said, "We've already begun integration planning. We'll be modernizing operations, expanding into new markets, and restructuring leadership. And David, this affects you directly. Your role as vice president will be reporting to Rachel effective immediately." And David's face went from confused to pale to red in the space of about 10 seconds. And my mother said, "Rachel, what is he talking about?" And I said exactly what it sounds like, Mom. "I bought Dad's company. I'm David's boss now." And my father stood up so fast his chair fell backwards, and he said, "You did what?" And I said, "I bought Chen Industries." "You sold it to me 6 months ago. Did you think I was going to let it sit dormant? Did you think I bought it as a trophy? I bought it to run it, and I'm going to turn it into something worth 10 times what you built." My father said, "You tricked me. You manipulated me into selling. And I said I offered you fair market value. You could have said no." And he said I did say no. And I said, "And then I convinced you otherwise. That's called negotiation. It's a business skill. I learned it from not having anyone believe in me." And David said, "You can't be serious. I've worked at that company for 8 years. I've earned my position." And I said, "You've had your position handed to you. There's a difference. And starting Monday, you'll have to actually earn it." And he said, "I'm not working for you." And I said, "Then you're unemployed, your choice." And Emily, who'd been quiet through all of this, said, "Rachel, this is incredibly petty. You bought a company just to prove a point to Dad." And I said, "No. I bought a company because I saw its potential, and I have the capital and the expertise to unlock it. The fact that it also proves a point is just a bonus." And I turned to my father and said, "You told me business wasn't for women. You told me I was too sensitive for the competitive environment. You told me to get a teaching certificate. And I took all of that doubt and I built something you couldn't imagine. And now I own the thing you said I could never have. And I'm going to make it better than you ever could." My mother started crying and said, "Why are you doing this? Why are you hurting this family?" And I said, "I'm not hurting the family. I'm succeeding. There's a difference. You just can't see it because you've never taken me seriously." And she said, "We've always taken you seriously." And I actually laughed and said, "Mom, you ask me every time we talk if I've met a nice man. You've never asked about my company. You've never asked about my work. You still think I play with computers." And she said, "Because we worry about you. We don't want you to be alone." And I said, "I'm not alone. James and I have been together for 2 years. But I didn't tell you because every time I try to share my life, you diminish it." And James put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Mr. and Mrs. Martinez, I know this is shocking, but Rachel is an exceptional CEO. She's transformed Phoenix into an industry leader. And she's going to do the same for Chen Industries. You should be proud of her." And my father said, "Proud? She just staged a hostile takeover of my company." And James said, "It wasn't hostile. You sold it willingly. Rachel has the documentation." And my father looked at me with something I'd never seen before. Maybe it was respect. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the realization that I wasn't the person he thought I was. And he said, "You planned this. You've been planning this for years." And I said, 10 years. "Since the day you told me tech wasn't for women. Since the day you laughed when I said I wanted to work at Chen Industries. I've been planning exactly this." David threw his napkin on the table and said, "I can't believe you. I can't believe you'd sabotage my career like this." And I said, "I'm not sabotaging your career. I'm giving you the opportunity to prove you're actually good at your job. You've been promoted based on being Dad's son. Now you'll be evaluated based on performance. And if you're as good as you think you are, you'll be fine." And he said, "I'm not working for my little sister." And I said, "Then clean out your desk Monday. I'll have HR process your resignation." And he looked at my father expecting support, but my father just sat there looking stunned. And Emily said, "This is going to destroy Dad. You know that, right? You've taken away the thing he built his entire life around." And I said, "No, I've taken ownership of it. The company will still exist. It will still employ the same people. It will still serve the same customers. It will just be run better. And my father will be financially secure with the money from the sale. This is a good outcome for everyone, except David's ego." My father finally spoke and said, "Rachel, I need you to understand what you've done. Chen Industries isn't just a company. It's my legacy. It's what I'm leaving for my children, and you've stolen it." And I said, "I didn't steal it. I bought it. And you're leaving $120 million for your children, which is more than most people leave. And as for legacy, I'm going to build a legacy that makes yours look small. I'm going to take your regional manufacturing company and turn it into a national brand. I'm going to modernize operations and expand markets. And in 5 years, Chen Industries will be worth $500 million. And that will be your legacy. That you built something good enough that your daughter saw its potential and made it great." And he said, "You're not doing this for the company. You're doing it for revenge." And I said, "I'm doing it because I can. Because I have the skills and the resources and the vision. The fact that it also proves you were wrong about me is just satisfying. And he stood up and said, I want you to leave. I want you out of my house. And I said, okay. But before I go, I need you to know something. I needed you to believe in me. I needed you to see me as capable. I needed you to give me a chance. And you never did. You never even considered that I might be worth betting on. And so I bet on myself. And I won. And I'm sorry that hurts you, but I'm not sorry I did it. I left with James, and we drove back to my hotel, and I felt simultaneously triumphant and devastated. Triumphant because I'd done exactly what I set out to do. Devastated because the victory was hollow when the people I'd wanted to impress most were too hurt and angry to appreciate it. And James said you knew this would happen. You knew they'd react this way. And I said knowing it and feeling it are different. And he said, do you regret it? And I said no. I regret that it had to come to this. I regret that they never believed in me enough that I didn't have to prove myself so dramatically. But I don't regret succeeding. I don't regret building something they said I couldn't build. And he said they'll come around eventually. They'll see what you've done and they'll be proud. And I said maybe. But I'm not doing this for their pride anymore. I'm doing it because I'm good at it. And because the company deserves good leadership. And because I have something to prove to myself, if not to them. The news broke Monday morning, and the business press went crazy. Articles about the tech CEO who'd bought her father's manufacturing company. Profiles of me talking about coming full circle. Think pieces about women in business and family dynamics and generational change. And my phone exploded with calls and texts. Reporters wanting interviews. Investors wanting to discuss the acquisition strategy. Former colleagues congratulating me. And somewhere in all of that noise was a text from David that said, you've made your point. You've humiliated me publicly. I hope you're happy. And I texted back, I didn't do this to humiliate you. I did this to succeed. Your humiliation is a byproduct of your own inflated ego. And he didn't respond. And later that day, my mother called and said, your father isn't speaking to anyone. He's devastated Rachel. And I said, I'm sorry he's hurt, but I'm not sorry I bought the company. And she said, why couldn't you just let David have it? Why did you need to take it from him? And I said, Mom, it was never David's, it was Dad's. And Dad sold it to me. David never had a claim to it except in his own mind. And she said, you've torn this family apart. And I said, no, this family was already broken. You just couldn't see it because the break was me. The tear was your constant dismissal of everything I accomplished. And now that dismissal has consequences. I didn't hear from my father for 6 weeks, and then he called me and said, I need to talk to you about the company. And I said, okay. And we met at a coffee shop near Chen Industries headquarters, and he looked older somehow, more tired. And he said, I've been thinking about what you said, about me never believing in you, and you're right, I didn't. I thought business was men's work, and I thought you'd get hurt trying to compete. And I was wrong. Clearly I was wrong. And I said, thank you for saying that. And he said, but I also need you to understand what it feels like to build something for 40 years and then watch someone take it. Even if that someone is your daughter, even if the sale was legal, it feels like theft. And I said, I understand that. And I'm sorry for the pain, but I'm not sorry for the action. And he said, I know. And maybe that's what hurts most, that you're not sorry that you'd do it again. And I said, yes. I would, because I'm good at this, because the company needs what I can bring. And because I spent 10 years being told I couldn't and I need to prove I can. And he said to who? To me. And I said yes, to you, to David, to Mom, to everyone who looked at me like I was the disappointment. And he said, you were never a disappointment, Rachel. You were different. And I didn't know how to handle different, and I said different isn't less. And he said, I know that now. We talked for 2 hours, and it wasn't reconciliation exactly, but it was understanding. Was both of us acknowledging that we'd hurt each other in different ways, and that maybe we could move forward from here. And he said, what are you going to do with the company? And I told him my plans, modernization and expansion and new product lines. And he listened and occasionally nodded. And at the end, he said, those are good plans, better than what I would have done. And I said, I learned from watching you. I learned about manufacturing and supply chains and labor relations, even though you didn't think I was paying attention. And he said, maybe I underestimated how much you absorbed. And I said, you underestimated all of me. But I'm used to that. And he said, I'd like to change that. I'd like to be part of your life again if you'll let me. Not as your father telling you what to do, but as someone who respects what you've built. And I said, I'd like that too. But it has to be real respect. Not patronizing, not conditional. And he said, I understand. And I think we both knew it would take time, that you don't undo 10 years of dismissal with one conversation, but it was a start. David never came back to work at Chen Industries. He resigned the day after the announcement and got a job at a competitor where presumably his father's last name didn't carry the same weight, and he had to prove himself on merit. And I heard through family gossip that it was good for him, that he was actually working hard for the first time and discovering he was capable when he applied himself. And I was glad, genuinely glad, because my goal had never been to destroy David. Just to stop letting his unearned advantages diminish my earned achievements. Emily and I had lunch 6 months after Thanksgiving, and she said, "I owe you an apology. I've spent the last 10 years assuming you were drifting, assuming you weren't serious about your career, and I didn't pay attention to what you were actually accomplishing. And I said thank you for saying that." And she said, "Watching you handle the Chen Industries acquisition has been humbling. You're a better business person than any of us." And I said I had to be. I didn't have the luxury of coasting on family name or family expectations. And she said that's fair. And I'm sorry I contributed to those expectations. And we talked about being women in male-dominated industries, and about family dynamics, and about how success looks different for different people. And it was the most honest conversation we'd ever had. 1 year after the acquisition, Chen Industries' revenue had grown 40%, and we'd expanded into 3 new markets, and employee satisfaction was the highest it had been in a decade. And the business press was writing articles calling me a turnaround specialist. And my father called me and said I saw the quarterly reports. "You've done remarkable things with the company." And I said, "Thank you. That means a lot." And he said I should have believed in you from the beginning. I should have seen that you had what it took, and I said you couldn't have known. I hadn't proven it yet, but I needed you to give me the chance to prove it, and you didn't. And he said that's my regret, that I let my assumptions about gender determine who I invested in. And I said learn from it. Hire women in leadership. Mentor young women the way you mentored David. Break the cycle. And he said I will, and I think he meant it. 2 years after the acquisition, my mother invited me to Thanksgiving and said it would be the whole family, including David and Emily and their partners. And she said I know it might be awkward, but I'd really like us to be together as a family. And I said I'll come, but I need everyone to understand that I'm not apologizing for buying the company. And she said no one's expecting you to apologize. We're past that. And I went to Thanksgiving with James, who is now my fiancé, and we sat at that same table where 2 years earlier David had made his toast about being someone the family could be proud of. And this year my father stood up with his wine glass and said I'd like to make a toast to Rachel, who taught us all that success isn't about following the path we expect, but about creating your own path and having the courage to walk it even when the people who should support you don't. And everyone raised their glasses, including David, who met my eyes and nodded. And my father continued, "I'm proud of you, Rachel. I should have said it 10 years ago, but I'm saying it now." And I felt something release in my chest that I'd been holding for a decade. And I raised my glass and said thank you. And I meant it. And for the first time in 10 years, Thanksgiving felt like it was actually something to be grateful for. The story could end there, with the family reconciliation and the toast and the understanding. But the real ending is what happened Monday morning after that Thanksgiving, when I walked into Chen Industries headquarters and saw the building that used to represent everything my family valued and everything they thought I couldn't have. And I realized it was just a building, just a company, just a thing. And the real victory wasn't owning it, wasn't proving them wrong. Wasn't even the financial success or the business press or the expansion. The real victory was that I'd bet on myself when no one else would, that I'd built something from nothing, that I'd trusted my own vision even when every voice around me said I was wrong. And that self-trust, that bone-deep knowledge that I could do hard things and succeed at them, that was mine before I bought the company, and it would be mine after. And the company was just the physical manifestation of a truth I'd learned the hard way. Which is that waiting for people to believe in you is a waste of time. Believing in yourself, and then proving it through action is the only path forward. And I'd walked that path alone for 10 years, and now I was walking it surrounded by people who finally saw me. And both versions were valid. Both versions were mine. But the alone version, the version where I had nothing but my own determination, that was the one that made me who I am, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Not even for the easier path where my family had believed in me from the start, because the path I walked taught me what I was capable of, taught me that being underestimated is sometimes a gift because it removes the pressure of expectation and lets you exceed every limitation people try to place on you. And I exceeded them all, and I'll keep exceeding them. And that's my legacy, not the company, not the acquisition, not the revenge. But the version of myself I became when I decided that other people's doubt was just noise, and my own certainty was all the permission I needed to build the life and the career and the success I knew I deserved.